The morning sun cast long shadows across the sprawling military base as Sarah Martinez adjusted her civilian clothes one last time before approaching the main gate. After 3 grueling months of recovery from her latest classified mission in Eastern Europe, she was finally returning to active duty. The familiar weight of her military ID felt foreign in her pocket after so long away from the structured life she had known for the past 8 years. At 28, Sarah had already achieved what most military personnel could only dream of. Her compact 5'6" frame belied the incredible strength and lethal precision that had earned her a place among the Navy's most elite Special Operations Unit. Years of intensive training had sculpted her body into a weapon, while her sharp mind had been honed through countless high-stakes missions that remained buried in classified files. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and, without her uniform, she looked more like a college graduate than one of the military's deadliest operatives. The base gate came into view, and Sarah noticed the usual complement of security personnel manning their posts. What caught her attention, however, was the commotion developing near the visitor checkpoint. A young man in crisp new fatigues was gesticulating wildly at one of the guards, his voice carrying across the morning air with an arrogance that made Sarah's jaw tighten instinctively. Private First Class Derek Thompson had arrived at the base just 2 weeks earlier, fresh out of basic training and brimming with the kind of misplaced confidence that often accompanied new recruits. At 22, he stood 6 feet tall with the lean build of someone who had excelled in physical training but had yet to face real challenges. His blonde hair was regulation cut, and his uniform bore the crisp lines that marked him as someone still trying to prove himself worthy of the respect he believed he automatically deserved. "Listen here, soldier," Derek was saying to the gate guard, his chest puffed out in a display of manufactured authority. "I don't care what your little computer says. I'm supposed to have level 2 clearance, and I'm not going to stand here while some weekend warrior tells me I can't access my own base." The guard, a seasoned staff sergeant named Williams, maintained his professional composure despite the obvious disrespect. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but the system shows your clearance is still pending. You'll need to contact your commanding officer to resolve this issue." Derek's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. In his mind, this was exactly the kind of bureaucratic nonsense that had no place in a real military operation. He had spent weeks telling anyone who would listen about his plans to fast-track into special operations, convinced that his natural athletic ability and competitive nature would quickly elevate him above the ordinary soldiers he found himself surrounded by. "This is ridiculous," Derek snapped, taking a step closer to the guard station. "Do you know who I am? I scored in the top 10% of my basic training class. I'm not some regular grunt who's going to be pushed around by pencil-pushing gate guards." Sarah had been planning to simply show her credentials and enter the base without incident, but Derek's increasingly aggressive behavior was drawing the attention of other personnel. She could see the tension building in the security team, and experience had taught her to recognize the warning signs of a situation that was about to spiral out of control. As Derek continued his tirade, Sarah noticed several other new recruits gathering behind him, drawn by the spectacle of someone challenging authority. Their faces showed a mixture of admiration and nervous excitement, as if they were witnessing something bold rather than the embarrassing display of immaturity it actually represented. "You know what your problem is?" Derek continued, jabbing his finger toward the guard. "You've been sitting behind this desk so long, you've forgotten what real military bearing looks like. When I make rank, and, trust me, it won't take long, I'll remember every gate guard who tried to make things difficult for me." The threat was veiled but unmistakable, and Sarah saw Staff Sergeant Williams's hand move almost imperceptibly toward his radio. The situation was escalating beyond a simple clearance issue and moving into territory that could result in serious disciplinary action for the young recruit. Derek seemed oblivious to the gravity of his error. In his mind, he was standing up for himself against an unfair system, demonstrating the kind of leadership qualities that would inevitably propel him to greatness. The fact that several other recruits were watching only reinforced his belief that he was setting an example of how a true soldier should behave when faced with obstacles. "Maybe you should step aside and let someone with real authority handle this," Derek said, his voice growing louder and more confrontational. "I'm sure there's a real soldier around here somewhere who understands how things actually work." It was at that moment that Derek noticed Sarah approaching the gate. She moved with a quiet confidence that suggested military training, but her civilian clothes and unassuming appearance led him to make a critical miscalculation. In his inflated sense of self-importance, he saw an opportunity to demonstrate his supposed superiority in front of an audience. "Excuse me, ma'am," Derek called out, his tone shifting to one of exaggerated politeness tinged with condescension. "I think you might be looking for the visitor's entrance. This is for military personnel only." Sarah paused, studying the young recruit with the kind of calm assessment that had served her well in far more dangerous situations. She could read the overconfidence in his posture, the way he positioned himself as if claiming territory, and the expectant looks from his fellow recruits who were clearly waiting to see how this encounter would unfold. "I'm exactly where I need to be," Sarah replied quietly, her voice carrying a subtle authority that Derek was too inexperienced to recognize. Derek's eyebrows rose in surprise and irritation. He had expected immediate compliance, perhaps even gratitude for his helpful direction. The fact that this civilian woman was questioning his guidance struck him as both disrespectful and indicative of the broader problems he perceived with military discipline. "Look, I'm trying to help you here," Derek said, taking a step toward Sarah with the kind of aggressive body language he had seen in movies about tough military leaders. "This isn't a place for civilians to wander around. There are procedures and protocols that people like you wouldn't understand." The other recruits shifted nervously, sensing that the situation was moving beyond their comfort zone but unsure how to intervene without appearing weak in front of Derek, who had positioned himself as their informal leader through his apparent willingness to challenge authority. Sarah remained perfectly still, her expression neutral but her eyes taking in every detail of Derek's stance, his positioning, and the way he seemed to be performing for his audience rather than engaging in genuine communication. Years of training had taught her to recognize the difference between real confidence and the brittle arrogance that often masked deep insecurity. "People like me," Sarah repeated softly, the words carrying a weight that Derek was completely unprepared to understand. Staff Sergeant Williams, who had been watching the interaction with growing concern, finally decided to intervene before the situation could deteriorate further. "Private Thompson, perhaps you should focus on resolving your own clearance issues rather than directing base traffic." But Derek was too committed to his performance to back down gracefully. The presence of an audience, combined with his inflated sense of his own importance, pushed him to double down on his aggressive approach. "With all due respect, Sergeant," Derek said, his tone making it clear that respect was the last thing on his mind, "I think I can handle one confused civilian." "Ma'am," he said, turning back to Sarah with an expression that mixed patronizing concern with barely concealed irritation, "I'm going to need you to move along now. This area is for authorized military personnel only, and I can't have you interfering with official business." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah found herself at a crossroads. Her natural inclination was to simply present her credentials and move on, avoiding unnecessary confrontation. But Derek's aggressive behavior toward the gate guard, combined with his assumption that he could dismiss her based on his own prejudices, represented exactly the kind of attitude that had no place in a professional military environment. More importantly, she could see that his behavior was being observed and potentially emulated by other young recruits who were still forming their understanding of what military leadership actually meant. Allowing his misconceptions to go unchallenged would be a disservice not only to the other soldiers but to Derek himself, who clearly needed to learn some fundamental lessons about respect, humility, and the true nature of military service. "I see," Sarah said, her voice remaining calm but carrying an undertone that should have warned Derek to reconsider his approach. "And you're qualified to make that determination how exactly?" The question caught Derek off guard. He had expected either immediate compliance or perhaps some flustered explanation that he could dismiss with magnanimous authority. Instead, this woman was challenging his competence, and doing so in front of the very audience he had been trying to impress. "I'm a United States Marine," Derek declared, though technically he was still in the Army and had never completed any advanced training beyond basic requirements. "I think I know military protocol when I see it." The statement was so factually incorrect and delivered with such misplaced confidence that several of the actual Marines present began to take notice of the situation. Staff Sergeant Williams, himself a Marine with 15 years of service, felt his patience finally reaching its limit. Sarah noticed the growing attention from base personnel, some of whom she recognized despite her time away. The situation had moved well beyond a simple misunderstanding and was now becoming a teaching moment that could have lasting consequences for everyone involved. Military protocol, Sarah mused, as if considering the phrase carefully. That's interesting. So in your understanding of military protocol, it's appropriate to threaten gate guards, make assumptions about people's authorization based on their appearance, and claim authority you haven't actually been granted? Derek's face flushed deeper red as he realized that his behavior was being scrutinized in ways he hadn't anticipated. The confident narrative he had constructed about his own competence was beginning to crack under the weight of actual examination. I wasn't threatening anyone, he said defensively, though his earlier words to Staff Sergeant Williams had been witnessed by multiple people. I was just trying to maintain proper security procedures. By refusing to follow the instructions of the security personnel who are actually responsible for maintaining those procedures? Sarah asked, her voice still maddeningly calm. The logic was unassailable, and Derek found himself trapped between his need to maintain face in front of his audience and the growing realization that his position was becoming increasingly untenable. Rather than accept the graceful exit that Sarah's questions offered, he chose to escalate further. Listen, lady, he said, dropping any pretense of politeness, I don't know what your problem is, but I'm not going to stand here and be lectured by some civilian who probably couldn't pass the first day of basic training. The insult hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down, and Sarah felt something shift in her expression. The teaching moment had just become something else entirely. The silence that followed Derek's insult seemed to stretch for an eternity, though in reality it lasted only a few seconds. Sarah could feel the weight of every gaze focused on her, waiting to see how she would respond to such a direct challenge. The recruit's words had crossed a line that transformed what could have remained a teachable moment into something far more serious. Staff Sergeant Williams instinctively took a step forward, his hand moving to his radio with the clear intention of calling for backup. He had seen situations like this before, where young recruits allowed their egos to write checks their abilities couldn't cash. What concerned him most was that Derek seemed genuinely unaware of how badly he was misjudging both the situation and the woman standing before him. Private Thompson, Williams said, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years of military service, I strongly suggest you reconsider your current course of action. But Derek was beyond listening to reason. The presence of his fellow recruits, combined with what he perceived as a challenge to his authority from a civilian, had triggered a response that overwhelmed any common sense he might have possessed. In his mind, backing down now would be a sign of weakness that would undermine his carefully constructed image as a natural leader. No, Sergeant, Derek said, his voice rising with each word. I'm tired of everyone acting like we should just accept whatever comes our way. This woman has no business being here, and if nobody else is going to do anything about it, then I will. Sarah studied the young recruit with the kind of clinical detachment she had learned to employ when assessing potential threats in hostile territory. She could see the telltale signs of someone whose anger was overriding their judgment, the way his fists were clenched at his sides, and the slight tremor in his voice that suggested he was more nervous than he wanted anyone to believe. What troubled her most was not Derek's behavior toward her, but rather the effect his attitude was having on the other young soldiers who were watching this unfold. Several of them were nodding in apparent agreement, as if his disrespectful treatment of both the gate guard and herself represented some admirable form of military bearing. You want to do something about it, Sarah said, her voice carrying a quiet intensity that made several nearby personnel instinctively take a step back. What exactly did you have in mind? Derek had been expecting fear, anger, or perhaps an attempt to flee. He had not anticipated that this seemingly ordinary woman would stand her ground and essentially invite him to escalate the confrontation. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his features as some deep-seated survival instinct tried to warn him that he was making a catastrophic error in judgment. But the momentum of his own rhetoric, combined with the pressure of performing in front of an audience, pushed him past the point of rational decision-making. In his warped perception of the situation, he was standing up for military values against someone who clearly didn't understand or respect them. What I have in mind, Derek said, taking another step toward Sarah and unconsciously adopting a more aggressive stance, is making sure you understand that this is a military installation with military rules. If you can't respect that, then maybe you need someone to explain it to you in terms you'll understand. The threat was unmistakable now, and Sarah felt her training automatically kick in. her breathing slowed, her muscles relaxed into a state of readiness, and her mind began calculating distances, angles, and potential responses with the kind of precision that had kept her alive through missions that remained classified at the highest levels. "You're going to explain military rules to me," Sarah said, and, for the first time since the confrontation began, there was something in her voice that should have given Derek serious pause. But the young recruit was too far gone to recognize the warning. Years of playing contact sports, combined with a few months of basic training, had convinced him that he possessed both the physical capability and moral authority to handle any situation that might arise. "That's exactly what I'm going to do," Derek said, his chest puffing out as he moved even closer to Sarah. "And the first rule you need to learn is that when military personnel tell you to move along, you move along." Several things happened simultaneously in the next few seconds. Staff Sergeant Williams reached for his radio to call for immediate backup, recognizing that the situation had moved well beyond his ability to control. The other recruits began to spread out in a loose semicircle, some eager to see their informal leader demonstrate his supposed superiority, others growing increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the confrontation. Most significantly, however, Sarah made a decision that would fundamentally alter Derek's understanding of the world he thought he knew. "Military personnel," she repeated, and there was something in the way she said the words that finally penetrated Derek's fog of misplaced confidence. "Show me your identification." The request caught Derek completely off guard. He had been prepared for tears, pleas, or perhaps an attempt to call for help. He had not expected this woman to essentially turn his own challenge back on him with such calm authority. "What?" Derek stammered, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "Your military identification," Sarah said, her voice taking on the unmistakable tone of command that had once directed special operations teams through life-or-death situations. "If you're going to invoke military authority to threaten civilians, I want to see your credentials." Derek's face flushed an even deeper shade of red as he realized that he was being challenged in a way that he was completely unprepared for. His hand moved instinctively toward his pocket where his military ID was kept, but something in Sarah's demeanor made him hesitate. "I don't have to show you anything," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had carried just moments before. "You're a civilian. You have no authority to make demands." "Civilian," Sarah said softly, and Staff Sergeant Williams felt a chill run down his spine as he began to realize exactly what was happening. "That's an interesting assumption. What makes you so certain about my status?" Derek's mouth opened and closed several times as he tried to formulate a response. The confident narrative that had sustained him through the confrontation was beginning to collapse as he found himself facing questions he couldn't answer satisfactorily. You're not in uniform," he finally managed, as if this observation somehow validated his entire approach to the situation. "Neither are you, technically," Sarah replied, her eyes noting the numerous regulation violations in Derek's appearance that his inexperience had prevented him from recognizing. "Your uniform is improperly worn, your bearing is unprofessional, and your conduct would be considered disgraceful by any serious military standard." The words hit Derek like physical blows, each observation stripping away another layer of the protective arrogance that had gotten him into this situation. Around him, his fellow recruits began to shift uncomfortably as they realized that their informal leader was being systematically dismantled by someone they had initially dismissed as an irrelevant civilian. Furthermore, Sarah continued, her voice taking on the kind of instructional tone that anyone with real military experience would immediately recognize, "Your assumption that civilians have no place on military installations demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern military operations function." Derek tried to interrupt, but Sarah's gaze silenced him before he could speak. Contractors, technical specialists, government liaisons, family members, and a host of other civilians are present on military bases every single day. A competent soldier would understand this. A professional soldier would recognize that making assumptions based on appearance is both tactically unsound and personally dangerous. Each word was delivered with surgical precision, designed not just to correct Derek's misconceptions but to expose the depth of his ignorance in front of the very audience he had been trying to impress. Staff Sergeant Williams found himself taking notes, recognizing that he was witnessing a masterclass in how to defuse a situation while simultaneously delivering a lesson that the recipient would never forget. "But, most importantly," Sarah said, taking a step forward that somehow managed to seem both non-threatening and utterly intimidating. A real soldier would never, under any circumstances, use their position to intimidate, threaten, or belittle another person based on assumptions about their background or capabilities. Derek's breathing had become noticeably shallow, and perspiration was beginning to show on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Some part of his mind was finally beginning to process the possibility that he had made a serious error in judgment, but his pride refused to allow him to acknowledge the growing evidence of his mistake. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I've been trained. I know how to handle situations like this." "Situations like what exactly?" Sarah asked. "Confronting unarmed individuals who haven't threatened you or anyone else? Using your perceived authority to compensate for your own insecurities? Please, enlighten me about this training you've received." The questions hung in the air like accusations, and Derek found himself completely unable to provide satisfactory answers. Everything he had been taught about military bearing, professional conduct, and situational awareness seemed to have abandoned him when he needed it most. Derek began, then stopped as he realized that any response would only dig him deeper into the hole he had created for himself. "Let me ask you something," Sarah said, her tone shifting to something that might almost have been considered gentle if not for the steel underlying every word. "How long have you been in the military?" 2 months, Derek mumbled, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. 2 months, Sarah repeated. "And, in those 2 months, how many combat deployments have you completed?" "None," Derek admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "How many classified operations have you participated in?" "None." "How many foreign languages do you speak fluently?" Derek didn't even bother to respond to this question, recognizing that every answer was painting him as increasingly unqualified for the authority he had claimed. "How many lives have you been responsible for in high-stress situations?" The silence that followed this question was deafening. Derek stood frozen, finally, beginning to understand that he was not just losing an argument but being systematically exposed as someone who had claimed authority he had never earned and demonstrated competence he clearly didn't possess. Sarah looked around at the gathered recruits, noting how their expressions had changed from admiration to confusion to something approaching horror as they realized what their informal leader had walked them all into. "I want all of you to understand something," she said, addressing the entire group for the first time. "The behavior you've witnessed here today represents everything that is wrong with military culture when it goes unchecked. Arrogance, assumptions, disrespect for others, and the abuse of perceived authority are not signs of strength or leadership. They are signs of weakness, insecurity, and fundamental unfitness for military service." The words carried the weight of absolute authority, and even Derek found himself unable to argue with the assessment. Everything that had seemed so clear and justified just minutes before now appeared foolish and shameful when viewed through the lens of someone who clearly understood military culture far better than he did. "Now," Sarah said, her attention returning to Derek, "I believe you were going to explain military rules to me. Please, proceed." Derek stood motionless, his face cycling through various shades of red and white as the full weight of his situation finally began to penetrate his consciousness. The confident young recruit who had arrived at the gate just minutes before had been replaced by someone who looked like he wanted nothing more than for the ground to open up and swallow him whole. His fellow recruits watched in fascination and growing horror as their informal leader found himself completely outmaneuvered by someone they had collectively dismissed as irrelevant. Staff Sergeant Williams, meanwhile, had been quietly observing the entire exchange with the kind of professional interest that comes from years of experience managing difficult personalities in high-stress environments. He had seen plenty of recruits arrive with inflated egos and unrealistic expectations, but Derek's performance was exceptional even by those standards. What impressed him more, however, was the clinical precision with which Sarah had dismantled the young man's pretensions without raising her voice or resorting to the kind of aggressive display that Derek himself had employed. "I'm waiting," Sarah said, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone who had all the time in the world to watch Derek dig himself deeper into whatever hole he was determined to create. Derek's mouth opened and closed several times as he struggled to formulate some kind of response that might salvage what remained of his dignity. The problem was that every word out of Sarah's mouth had systematically exposed the gaps in his knowledge and experience, leaving him with nothing substantial to fall back on except the kind of bluster that had gotten him into this mess in the first place. The rules are. Derek began, then trailed off as he realized he couldn't actually articulate what rules Sarah had supposedly violated. She wasn't trespassing, wasn't causing a disturbance, and hadn't demonstrated any behavior that would justify his aggressive response. The only violation of military protocol that had occurred was his own unprofessional conduct. Yes? Sarah prompted, her eyebrows rising slightly as she waited for Derek to complete his thought. You're supposed to. I mean, civilians aren't. Derek stammered, his carefully constructed worldview crumbling under the weight of actual scrutiny. Civilians aren't what, exactly? Sarah asked. Allowed to exist? Permitted to move freely unless challenged by every recruit who thinks he understands security protocols? Required to submit to interrogation by anyone wearing a uniform, regardless of their actual authority or competence? Each question hit Derek like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the fundamental absurdity of his position. Around him, the other recruits were beginning to edge away, as if proximity to their former leader might somehow contaminate them with his spectacular failure of judgment. One of the younger recruits, a 19-year-old private named Johnson who had looked up to Derek as someone who seemed to understand how military life worked, finally found the courage to speak up. Maybe we should just go, Johnson said quietly, his voice carrying a note of desperation as he recognized that the situation had moved well beyond anything they were equipped to handle. But Derek, trapped between his shattered ego and his inability to admit error, chose the worst possible response to his deteriorating situation. Instead of accepting the graceful exit that his fellow recruit had offered, he decided to double down on his failing strategy. No, Derek said, his voice rising with renewed aggression as he turned toward Johnson. We're not going anywhere. This woman thinks she can just walk onto our base and disrespect American soldiers. Well, I've got news for her. The announcement sent a collective shiver of dread through everyone present who had enough experience to recognize that Derek was about to make his situation exponentially worse. Staff Sergeant Williams actually took a step forward, his hand moving toward his radio with the clear intention of calling for immediate intervention before the situation could escalate further. But Sarah raised her hand in a subtle gesture that somehow conveyed to the experienced NCO that she had everything under control. Williams hesitated, his professional instincts warring with his growing curiosity about exactly who this woman was and how she had managed to achieve such complete psychological dominance over someone who clearly considered himself a physical threat. Our base, Sarah repeated, her voice taking on a tone that would have warned anyone with real military experience that they were approaching extremely dangerous territory. Tell me, Private Thompson, what exactly makes this your base? Derek's confidence, artificially renewed by his own rhetoric, pushed him to make what would prove to be his final critical error. I'm a United States soldier, he declared, puffing out his chest in a display that would have been comical if it weren't so tragically misguided. I've earned the right to be here through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. I've proven myself worthy of defending this country and everything it stands for. The words hung in the air like a challenge to the universe itself, and Sarah felt something shift in her expression that made several nearby personnel instinctively take a step back. The patience she had shown throughout the confrontation was beginning to give way to something far more dangerous. Blood, sweat, and sacrifice, she said softly, and there was something in the way she pronounced each word that seemed to invest them with terrible weight. 2 months of basic training. No deployments. No combat experience. No special qualifications or advanced training. No command experience or leadership positions. Derek tried to interrupt, but Sarah continued speaking with the kind of relentless precision that had once been used to brief Joint Chiefs of Staff on operations that could affect global stability. You have never been shot at in anger. You have never held a dying comrade in your arms. You have never made decisions that determined whether innocent people lived or died. You have never operated behind enemy lines with nothing but your training and the trust of your teammates to keep you alive. Each statement landed with devastating accuracy, stripping away another layer of Derek's manufactured identity until he stood exposed as exactly what he was, an inexperienced recruit who had mistaken arrogance for confidence and attitude for competence. You have never sacrificed anything, Sarah continued, her voice taking on the kind of quiet intensity that suggested she was drawing from personal experience rather than theoretical knowledge. You have never earned anything through genuine hardship. You have never proven yourself worthy of anything more challenging than completing basic requirements under carefully controlled conditions. Derek's breathing had become noticeably labored, and his hands were shaking slightly as the full implications of Sarah's words began to sink in. Around him, his fellow recruits were staring at him with expressions that ranged from pity to outright disgust as they realized how thoroughly their informal leader had been exposed as a fraud. But, most importantly, Sarah said, taking another step forward that somehow managed to make Derek appear smaller despite his physical advantages, you have never demonstrated anything even approaching the kind of character, integrity, or genuine commitment that military service actually requires. The accusation hung in the air like a verdict, and Derek found himself completely unable to formulate any kind of response. Everything he thought he knew about himself, everything he had believed about his own capabilities and worth, had been systematically dismantled by someone who clearly understood military culture in ways that he had never even imagined. So when you talk about earning the right to be here, Sarah continued, her voice carrying a finality that suggested the conversation was approaching its conclusion, when you claim authority based on blood, sweat, and sacrifice you've never actually experienced, you're not just making a fool of yourself. You're dishonoring everyone who has actually paid those prices. Staff Sergeant Williams found himself nodding unconsciously at the assessment, recognizing the truth in every word despite his natural inclination to support subordinates when they found themselves in difficult situations. Derek's behavior had moved well beyond the kind of rookie mistakes that could be excused or overlooked, and had entered territory that required serious corrective action. Derek seemed to shrink into himself as the weight of his situation finally became undeniable. The confident narrative that had sustained him through months of military training was collapsing under the pressure of contact with someone who actually embodied the qualities he had only pretended to possess. Derek began, then, stopped as he realized that any words he might offer would only make his humiliation more complete. You what? Sarah asked, her tone suggesting genuine curiosity about what possible justification Derek might attempt to offer for his behavior. I thought. Derek tried again, then, fell silent as he confronted the reality that his thoughts had been based on fundamentally flawed assumptions about himself, his capabilities, and his place in the military hierarchy. You thought what, exactly? That putting on a uniform automatically entitled you to treat other people with disrespect? That a few months of basic training had somehow transformed you into someone qualified to make decisions about security protocols? That your personal insecurities gave you the right to intimidate anyone you perceived as vulnerable? Each question forced Derek to confront another aspect of his behavior that he had never seriously examined. The comfortable self-justifications that had allowed him to act with such aggressive confidence were crumbling under the weight of actual analysis. I don't understand, Derek finally managed to whisper, his voice carrying a note of genuine confusion as his worldview continued to collapse around him. What don't you understand? Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. How did you? Derek began, then, stopped as he realized he was about to ask a question that would confirm his complete failure to assess the situation accurately from the very beginning. How did I what? Sarah prompted. How did you know? Derek finished, his voice barely audible as he finally acknowledged that he had been operating from a position of fundamental ignorance throughout the entire confrontation. Sarah studied the young recruit for a long moment, considering how to respond to what was clearly a genuine question despite its origin in spectacular misjudgment. Around them, the other personnel waited in fascination to see how this extraordinary confrontation would finally resolve itself. I know, Sarah said finally, because I've actually lived the life you've been pretending to understand. The statement carried implications that were only beginning to penetrate Derek's consciousness, but, before he could ask for clarification, Staff Sergeant Williams stepped forward with an expression that suggested the educational portion of the morning was about to give way to more practical concerns. Ma'am, Williams said, his tone carrying a respect that made Derek's eyes widen in confusion, would you prefer to handle this situation yourself, or should I contact the appropriate authorities? The question confirmed what Derek was only beginning to suspect, that his assumptions about Sarah's identity and authority had been not just wrong, but catastrophically wrong. As the implications began to dawn on him, his face went from red to pale in a matter of seconds. The moment Staff Sergeant Williams addressed Sarah with unmistakable deference, Derek felt his world tilt on its axis. The respectful tone, the formal address, the implication that Sarah might have authority to handle the situation herself, all of these details crashed together in his mind like pieces of a puzzle he had been too arrogant to attempt solving. "Ma'am?" Derek repeated weakly, his voice cracking slightly as the word escaped his lips. The confident young recruit who had started this confrontation seemed to have vanished entirely, replaced by someone who looked like he was experiencing a waking nightmare. Sarah reached into her jacket pocket with deliberate slowness, her movements precise and controlled in a way that immediately commanded the attention of everyone present. When her hand emerged, she was holding a military identification card that she extended toward Staff Sergeant Williams with the kind of casual authority that comes from years of having that authority acknowledged without question. Williams took the ID and examined it with the careful attention that comes from years of military experience. As his eyes moved across the information displayed on the card, his expression shifted through several distinct phases: recognition, surprise, respect, and, finally, something approaching awe. "Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez," Williams read aloud, his voice carrying a weight that made Derek feel like he might actually be sick. "United States Navy. Special Operations Command." The words hit Derek like physical blows, each syllable driving home the magnitude of his error in judgment. He had challenged, threatened, and attempted to intimidate a naval officer whose rank alone placed her far above him in the military hierarchy. But the designation Special Operations Command carried implications that were even more terrifying. "DevGru," Williams continued, reading from the card with growing amazement. "Naval Special Warfare Development Group." The acronym meant nothing to Derek in his current state of shock, but the reactions of the more experienced personnel around him made it clear that he had stumbled into something far beyond his comprehension. Several of the base staff who had been watching the confrontation from a distance were now moving closer, drawn by the realization that they were in the presence of someone whose very existence was typically classified. Sarah accepted her identification back from Williams and returned it to her pocket with the same casual precision she had used to retrieve it. Her expression remained neutral, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she was carefully considering how to handle a situation that had moved well beyond a simple teaching moment. "DevGru," Derek repeated numbly, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. "What's DevGru?" The question hung in the air for a moment before one of the other recruits, a young woman named Private Martinez who had been watching the entire confrontation with growing horror, found the courage to answer. "SEAL Team 6, she whispered, her voice carrying the kind of reverence typically reserved for legendary figures. "She's Navy SEAL Team 6. The revelation hit Derek like a freight train, and he actually staggered backward as the full implications of his behavior began to register. Navy SEAL Team 6 was not just an elite military unit, it was the pinnacle of Special Operations Forces, the unit responsible for some of the most classified and dangerous missions in modern military history. He had not just challenged a superior officer, he had threatened someone whose training, experience, and capabilities existed on a level that he couldn't even begin to comprehend. The confidence he had felt in his own physical abilities, the authority he had claimed based on 2 months of basic training, the assumptions he had made about his own competence, all of it crumbled into meaningless dust when compared to the reality of who Sarah actually was. "Oh God," Derek breathed, his voice barely audible as the full weight of his situation crashed down on him. "Oh my God, what have I done?" Sarah watched the young recruit's dawning comprehension with the clinical interest of someone who had seen many people confront their own limitations under extreme circumstances. The arrogance and aggression that had characterized his behavior just minutes before had been completely replaced by something approaching existential terror. "What you've done," Sarah said quietly, "is provide an excellent demonstration of why assumptions can be dangerous, why respect should be given before it's demanded, and why military bearing involves far more than wearing a uniform and adopting an aggressive attitude." Derek nodded frantically, his head bobbing like a dashboard ornament as he struggled to show some kind of acknowledgement of his error. The other recruits who had been watching the confrontation were now staring at him with expressions that ranged from pity to outright disgust, as if his spectacular failure of judgment had somehow contaminated them by association. "Lieutenant Commander," Staff Sergeant Williams said, his voice carrying the formal tone appropriate for addressing someone of Sarah's rank and reputation, "how would you like to proceed?" The question forced Derek to confront another terrifying reality. Sarah now had to decide what consequences he would face for his behavior. A complaint from someone of her rank and standing could end his military career before it had truly begun. Worse, his threatening behavior toward a superior officer could potentially result in criminal charges under military law. Sarah considered the question for a long moment, her gaze moving from Derek to the other recruits who had been swept up in his misguided display of bravado. She could see the fear in their eyes, the recognition that they had all come very close to being associated with behavior that could have serious consequences for their own military futures. "Private Thompson," Sarah said, and Derek immediately snapped to attention with the kind of precision that should have been evident in his bearing from the beginning. "Do you understand what happened here today?" "Yes, ma'am," Derek replied, his voice cracking with emotion. "I mean, no ma'am. I mean." He took a shaky breath and tried to organize his thoughts. "I think I understand that I made a terrible mistake, ma'am." "What kind of mistake?" Sarah asked, her tone suggesting that she wanted a complete accounting rather than a vague acknowledgement of error. Derek's face cycled through several expressions as he struggled to articulate the full scope of his failures. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I disrespected a superior officer. I made assumptions based on appearance rather than facts. I threatened someone without justification. I violated military protocol and failed to demonstrate proper military bearing." He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "And I did all of it because I was trying to impress people instead of doing what was right." The confession was delivered with the kind of painful honesty that suggested Derek was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his error. Around him, his fellow recruits listened with the fascination of people watching someone else's life implode in real time. "Those are the technical violations," Sarah acknowledged. "But what's the underlying problem that made those violations possible?" Derek struggled with the question for several seconds, his face contorting with the effort of genuine self-examination. When he finally answered, his voice carried a note of shame that made it clear he was confronting some uncomfortable truths about himself. "I thought I was more important than I actually am," he said slowly. "I thought I knew more than I actually do. I thought I had earned respect and authority that I haven't actually earned." Sarah nodded, recognizing that Derek was finally engaging with the real issues that had led to his spectacular failure of judgment. "And how do you think those misconceptions affected your behavior toward Staff Sergeant Williams?" she asked. Derek's face flushed with renewed shame as he was forced to confront another aspect of his conduct. "I was disrespectful to someone who was just doing his job," Derek admitted. "I treated him badly because I was frustrated, and I acted like my problems were his fault when they weren't." "And toward the other recruits who were watching?" "I set a terrible example," Derek said, his voice growing stronger as he worked through his analysis. "I showed them that it was okay to be disrespectful and aggressive, and I put them in a position where they might have gotten in trouble just for being associated with me." Sarah could see that Derek was finally engaging in the kind of genuine self-reflection that might actually lead to meaningful change. The arrogant young recruit who had started the confrontation was being replaced by someone who was beginning to understand the difference between actual military bearing and the posturing he had mistaken for leadership. "Lieutenant Commander," Staff Sergeant Williams interjected, "if I may make a suggestion?" Sarah turned her attention to the experienced NCO, recognizing that his perspective might offer valuable insight into how to handle the situation constructively. "Private Thompson clearly needs additional training in military protocol and bearing," Williams said diplomatically. "Perhaps this incident could serve as the foundation for some intensive education rather than punitive action." The suggestion offered Derek a potential lifeline, though one that would likely involve considerable additional training and scrutiny. Sarah considered the proposal while studying Derek's expression, trying to gauge whether he had genuinely learned from his experience or was simply desperate to avoid consequences. "What do you think, Private?" Sarah asked. "Do you believe additional training would address the problems we've identified today?" Derek's response would determine not just his immediate fate, but potentially the entire trajectory of his military career. As he opened his mouth to reply, every person present waited to see whether the lessons of the morning had actually penetrated his consciousness or whether his apparent contrition was simply another form of performance designed to minimize consequences. The next few words out of Derek's mouth would reveal whether a foolish young recruit could transform his spectacular failure into the foundation for genuine growth, or whether the same character flaws that had led to his humiliation would prevent him from learning from the experience. Standing at attention in front of someone whose achievements made his own accomplishments seem laughably insignificant, Derek faced the first truly important decision of his military career. Derek stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, the weight of Sarah's question settling over him like a physical presence. Every person present could see the internal struggle playing out across his features as he grappled with what might be his last opportunity to salvage something positive from the wreckage of his spectacular misjudgment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality that hadn't been present in any of his previous statements, genuine humility born from the painful recognition of his own limitations. "Ma'am," Derek began, his words carefully measured and delivered with the kind of precision that suggested he was finally taking the situation as seriously as it deserved. "I don't think additional training would just address the problems we've identified. I think additional training is the only thing that might help me become the kind of soldier I thought I already was." The response clearly surprised several of the people listening, including Sarah herself. There was something in Derek's tone that suggested he was engaging with the question on a deeper level than simply trying to avoid consequences. "Explain what you mean by that," Sarah said, her voice carrying a note of genuine interest rather than the clinical assessment that had characterized most of their interaction. Derek took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts with visible effort before responding. "When I came to this base this morning, I thought I understood what military service meant," he said slowly. "I thought it was about being tough, being aggressive, proving that you're stronger than other people. I thought respect was something you could demand just by wearing a uniform and acting confident." He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "But watching you handle this situation, seeing how you maintain control without ever raising your voice or making threats, understanding that someone with your qualifications and experience could be so calm and professional, it's made me realize that I don't understand anything about real military service." Sarah found herself studying Derek with renewed interest. The arrogant young recruit was clearly still there beneath the surface, but something had shifted in his perspective that suggested the morning's events might have created an opportunity for genuine growth. "Real military service," Sarah repeated. "What do you think that involves?" Derek's face contorted with concentration as he wrestled with concepts that were clearly new to his thinking. "I think it involves actually earning the respect you want people to show you," he said finally. "Not just claiming it because of what you're wearing or where you think you fit in some hierarchy. And I think it involves taking responsibility for other people's safety and well-being, not just using your position to make yourself feel important." Staff Sergeant Williams found himself nodding approvingly at Derek's analysis, recognizing the beginnings of genuine understanding in the young recruit's words. "Go on," Sarah encouraged, her tone shifting subtly to something that might almost be considered supportive. "I think real military service means putting the mission and your fellow soldiers ahead of your own ego," Derek continued, his confidence growing as he worked through ideas that were clearly developing in real time. "And I think it means understanding that leadership isn't about intimidating people or making them afraid of you. It's about making them better and helping them succeed." The transformation in Derek's thinking was evident to everyone present, but Sarah wanted to push deeper to see whether his new perspective could withstand additional scrutiny. "Those are good insights," she acknowledged. "But insights are easy. The real question is whether you're willing to do the hard work necessary to transform those insights into actual changes in your behavior and character." Derek's face took on an expression of determined resolve that was entirely different from the artificial confidence he had displayed at the beginning of the confrontation. "Ma'am, I know I can't undo what happened here today," he said. "I can't take back the disrespect I showed to Staff Sergeant Williams, or the way I treated you, or the terrible example I set for the other recruits. But if you and Staff Sergeant Williams are willing to give me the chance, I'd like to try to prove that I can learn from this and become someone worthy of wearing this uniform." The statement carried a sincerity that impressed everyone present, but Sarah knew that good intentions were often fleeting in the face of real challenges. "That's a significant commitment," she said. "The kind of training and development you're talking about would be intensive, demanding, and often humiliating. It would require you to confront and overcome character flaws that run much deeper than simple ignorance or inexperience." Derek nodded vigorously, his expression suggesting that he welcomed rather than feared the prospect of difficult challenges. "Ma'am, an hour ago I thought I was ready for special operations training," he said, his voice carrying a note of rueful self-awareness. "Now I realize I'm not even ready for basic military service. If there's a program or training regimen that can help me bridge that gap, I want to be part of it, no matter how difficult it might be." Sarah exchanged a meaningful look with Staff Sergeant Williams, recognizing that they were witnessing something relatively rare, a genuine moment of growth and self-awareness that might serve as the foundation for real transformation. "Staff Sergeant Williams," Sarah said, "what kind of developmental program do you think might be appropriate for someone in Private Thompson's situation?" Williams considered the question carefully, his expression suggesting that he was weighing various options against Derek's specific needs and the resources available on the base. "We have an intensive leadership development program that focuses on military bearing, professional conduct, and character development," he said finally. "It's typically reserved for NCOs and officer candidates, but, in exceptional circumstances, it can be adapted for enlisted personnel who show potential for growth." Derek's eyes widened with something that looked like hope, but Sarah wasn't finished with her assessment. "The program Staff Sergeant Williams is referring to has a failure rate of approximately 60%, she said bluntly. "Most people who enter it discover that changing ingrained patterns of thinking and behavior is far more difficult than they anticipated." "Are you prepared for the possibility that you might not be able to complete it successfully?" Derek's response came without hesitation, suggesting that he had already considered and accepted this possibility. "Ma'am, if I fail the program, at least I'll fail while trying to become better rather than failing because I was too arrogant to recognize my own limitations," he said. "Either way, I'll learn something about myself and about what real military service requires." The maturity of Derek's response clearly impressed both Sarah and Staff Sergeant Williams, who had seen many young recruits struggle with far less challenging situations. "There would be conditions," Sarah said, her tone becoming more businesslike as she outlined the parameters of what Derek was requesting. "You would be required to make formal apologies to everyone you disrespected today, beginning with Staff Sergeant Williams. You would need to address the other recruits who witnessed your behavior and explain what you've learned about proper military conduct." Derek nodded eagerly, clearly willing to accept any conditions that might allow him to rebuild his reputation and continue his military career. "You would also be required to undergo regular counseling sessions to address the underlying attitudes and assumptions that led to this incident," Sarah continued. "And you would be subject to immediate dismissal from the program if you demonstrate any recurrence of the kind of arrogance or disrespect you showed today." "Yes, ma'am," Derek said immediately. "I understand and accept all of those conditions." Sarah studied the young recruit for a long moment, weighing his apparent sincerity against her experience with people who promised to change when faced with serious consequences. Finally, she turned to Staff Sergeant Williams with a slight nod. "Staff Sergeant, I believe Private Thompson should be given the opportunity he's requesting," she said. "However, I want to be kept informed of his progress, and I reserve the right to revisit this decision if his performance doesn't meet expectations." Williams nodded his understanding and acceptance of the arrangement, recognizing that Sarah was essentially placing Derek under her personal oversight while allowing him the chance to prove himself worthy of continued military service. Derek's face lit up with genuine gratitude, but before he could express his thanks, Sarah raised her hand to forestall any premature celebration. "Understand something, Private," she said, her voice carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. "This is not a second chance. This is your first chance, your first real opportunity to demonstrate that you're capable of the kind of character and commitment that military service actually requires. The person you've been up until today was never qualified to serve, regardless of what basic training might have told you about your capabilities." Derek nodded solemnly, recognizing the truth in Sarah's assessment and the magnitude of the opportunity he was being given. "I won't waste it, ma'am," he said quietly. "I promise." Sarah's expression softened slightly, though her voice remained firm. "Don't make promises you can't keep, Private. Just focus on doing the work, day by day, and let your actions speak for your character. Real change happens gradually, through consistent effort, not through dramatic declarations." As the confrontation finally drew to a close, the other recruits who had witnessed Derek's transformation began to disperse, each carrying their own lessons about the difference between genuine military bearing and the kind of posturing that had nearly destroyed their informal leader's career before it had truly begun. Derek remained at attention as Sarah prepared to continue her journey onto the base, but she paused for one final comment. "Private Thompson," she said, "remember that the goal is not to become someone who can intimidate others or command respect through fear. The goal is to become someone worthy of the trust that military service requires, trust from your fellow soldiers, from the civilians you've sworn to protect, and from yourself." With that, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez, Navy SEAL Team 6 operative, walked through the gate and into the base, leaving behind a young recruit who had learned more about himself and about military service in one morning than he had in all his previous training combined. Derek remained at attention long after Sarah had disappeared from view, finally beginning to understand what it truly meant to serve.